Hey everyone, this is Hanney Seylim of Critical Faculty. Today is the day we are going to finally put a nagging pain to bed, I hope. Please welcome with me Dr. Richard Carrier. Hello, Dr. Richard.
Hello, always glad to be on.
Fantastic. Well, I'm not very sure how excited you are about this one, but I am utterly excited. And we've got something to celebrate with.
Yes.
I'm drinking to that for sure.
Yeah.
But well, let's start with syllogism, because as soon as you see an Aristotelian deductive syllogism, you know that you're in trouble, because if the propositions are true, the conclusion would usually follow. But the whole thing is in the propositions in the first two items. What do you think of them?
Yeah, I know, absolutely. I wrote an article on my blog, unrelated to this subject, but it was on free will, and it was on the perils of syllogistic reasoning, that people are too easily seduced by this because of what you say. Like, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. So it looks like, oh, deductive certainty, like this is rock solid, like there's nothing shaky about this. But the thing is, the trick is that it's too easy to put false premises in or circular premises. It's too easy to build those in ways that don't actually prove anything, because you're relying on assumptions that you aren't proving, and yet those are the assumptions that you actually need to be proving. And so syllogisms are dangerous. I really, whenever I see a syllogism, I'm always extremely skeptical. I need to all right, now first we need to vet the logic of this, then we need to start vetting the premises of this. And I've seen this in just from atheist philosophers too, even like the over-reliance on syllogistic reasoning. But it's definitely a weapon used by when you have disingenuous Christian apologists. Who are willing to skirt the truth deliberately. They can abuse this technique.
Yeah, and one of the things about deductive reasoning, it doesn't bring any outside ideas. It's almost big into question, because everything within the equation. But you've got to take the premises first to accept the conclusion. It doesn't bring any outside knowledge.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if it does it in the premises, right? And so it's like, wait a minute, you're assuming the things that you want to prove. So hold on, let's stop and then roll back. And that's why I was so glad to see, people have debunked the Kalam cosmological argument many times before. And I guess we'll introduce exactly what that is in a moment. But, and I've seen, lots of debunkings of it, but I imagine, like you had mentioned to me before the show, that the thing that inspired you doing this show was the latest Skydive Phil video on it, which was a masterpiece of debunking. And it's the kind of thing that I had wanted to see done for the longest time, but I don't have the resources to pull all together all those actual experts on video and just do that. And I'm so glad that they were willing to do it, and they got able to get all those people on and organize it so well. It's the best crushing of the Kalam that I've ever seen.
Right. How about introduce the folks to the syllogism, and let's just dissect it one by one. So do you want to sort of introduce it and let's...
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Kalam cosmological argument has roots in medieval Arabic Muslim apologetics, but it's mostly been used lately by Christian apologists, especially William Lane Craig. He's most known for it, but other philosophers, other Christian apologists have used it as well, and you'll see it on the internet everywhere, right? And so I won't phrase it exactly right, but it's basically everything that begins to exist has a cause. Everything must have had a beginning, therefore there had to have been a cause, and then there's usually some hand waving here, and then you get to God. But if they're disciplined enough to put another premise in, they say, well, if everything beginning requires a mechanistic cause, and there can't have been a mechanistic cause, and so they'll say something like, well, it was either mechanistic or personal, and then hand wave, therefore it was personal. There's not a lot of syllogism in there, but there's that extra step where they try to argue that it had to be an immaterial cause somehow. That one's usually the haziest part of it, but the rock solid part that looks rock solid is every beginning has a cause. There had to be a beginning, therefore there was a first cause, and then they try to get to God somehow by various ways.
Yeah, I'm going to show it briefly on the screen here for people just to sort of read it kind of slowly. Yeah, that's the one, folks. So we're going to dissect this and see if the premises are indeed true, because I think this is where the trick is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can grant that the conclusion follows if the premises are true, right? So that's the attractiveness of it. But it is those premises, those two premises, that are a problem. And it actually leads to three errors from the proponents of this, three factual errors, actually. But I don't know if you want to do more introduction before we get into it, or what.
Well, so we talked to, so it was developed by Islamic apologist Al-Ghazali that developed it, and this was a world still influenced by Aristotle. We're trying to probe knowledge. We're trying to understand how things move. Obviously, modern science hasn't been developed, and people were doing their best with the tools they've got to infer what is really happening. So things like causality, first cause, prime movers were quite in fashion, and obviously it's been picked up. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. And in both worlds, or both the Middle East and Europe, around the same time, or within a few centuries of each other, the same kinds of concerns. Aristotle was the hot item at the time, and even though none of this is Aristotle, like Aristotle would have argued against almost everything here, because he was an eternalist. He was an eternalist. He thought the universe was past eternal. He even advanced arguments for why it had to be past eternal. So he would not have agreed with the first premise, or with the second premise. And the first premise would hinge on, Aristotle would say, well, what do you mean by a cause? Right. So he would have zeroed in right on, like, well, if there was a first thing, then obviously something must have existed without a cause. Right. If there's a first mover, there's a first cause. If there's a first cause, then something exists without a cause. So Aristotle would have had a problem with the first premise as well. So there's something self-contradictory about it. So even Aristotle would not have agreed with these things, but they're at least using the vocabulary and the concepts that Aristotle introduced to them.
As a matter of courtesy, we'll take some super chats, but I would really, really appreciate it, guys, if you can keep the questions within the topic of the conversation. That way, Dr. Karyir isn't distracted often. But as a courtesy, we'll take. But this one here,
this one's on topic. So I actually updated that. It's called The Problem with Nothing. So people who might want to start with The Problem with Nothing, because I actually formalize it more. That's where I have an argument that if you start with the Christian assumption that there was once absolutely nothing, and you take seriously the premise that there was absolutely nothing, meaning there couldn't even been rules to govern what would happen, like literally nothing, that you could show through logical certainty that there would be an infinite multiverse that would just arise, right? And this is a controversial thing to claim, but it's hard to refute. But I don't think we need that argument tonight. We're going to show that the Kalam Cosmological argument is complete bullshit, if I can say that. Even without that argument, you don't need my Mare die fit argument to do that. You can just look at the premises and show logically and scientifically they are all false or undemonstrated, which is enough to crush the argument, essentially.
Yeah, I never understood the ex nihilo thing is for nothing to exist. It becomes something by existing as a nothing. So
it's self-contradictory, right? So if you say from nothing only nothing comes, you're saying, well, then you're describing a law of physics. Yeah. That's not nothing, that's something. So if you take away everything, so there is nothing, then you also have to take away that rule. You have to take away that law of physics that only nothing comes from nothing. So you're taking that away too. Well, if you've taken that away, well, the rest follows, right? If you no longer have the rule that only nothing comes from nothing, well, then what does come from nothing? And it's random, and then because there's no rules governing it, so you actually can get to a very uncomfortable place for a Christian by using their own premise. Even
if God's creating ex nihilo, God is there to create ex nihilo.
Right,
therefore, there is something.
It's not nothing. Yeah, and this is a lot of criticism. A lot of criticism of Krauss, right? Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing. People criticize that, theologians especially, criticize that by saying, well, he's not starting with nothing. He's starting with basic quantum mechanics, right? There's space-time and quantum mechanical laws. So he's starting with that. And like, yes, but you're starting with God. He's at least starting with things we know exist. And if you can start with things we know exist and get everything, well, then we don't need your God hypothesis, right? So that's kind of the correct way to go back at that when they try to claim that he's not talking about absolutely nothing. Now, I think he probably should have. He should have added a chapter about this very point that I'm making, and I think that made it easy to strawman his book. But it's still a valid point that he's starting with a much simpler, well-evidenced starting point than theology does. Theology is ignoring what he's discovered or what he's pointing out and just making up wild conjectures of things for which there's no evidence whatsoever and are highly implausible. And they think that's a better explanation. It really isn't. It's actually a much worse explanation, frankly, by all the standards of explanations.
Tell me, Dr. Carrier, if I'm on the right track here. Is William Lane Craig exploiting a vague area between our understanding of infinity and common sense? Because obviously this is where common sense collapsed, and he would use that to say this is not in, yeah.
He is exploiting scientific illiteracy in the public, right? People aren't taught these things, aren't encouraged to learn about them. And so he's exploiting their ignorance. He really is, because he knows, he's been told over and over again that the things he's saying are false. And he's been told this by multiple actual experts. And you can even tell in the video that Skydive Phil just did, for those who want to know about that, the title of that is Physicists and Philosophers Reply to the Kalam Cosmological Argument, featuring Penrose, Hawking, Guth. And you can find that on the Skydive Phil YouTube channel. And
I've just right now put a link, and I'm displaying it as we speak.
Yeah. So, and what they do in this video, this is the thing that I was just a dream. This was amazing that they did this. And they've done this piecemeal before, but this is the first video where they did it all in one place. And they did it in 3 parts, and they do all the 3 assumptions that Craig is basing his arguments on. And one is, as we'll get to, he claims that you can't have an actual infinity. So the past, there had to be a beginning in the past because you can't have an actual infinity. So they bring in a bunch of actual mathematicians explaining that that's false, that Craig is wrong. He's not telling the truth to his audience. And then the second third of it is about the beginning of time, that because there was a Big Bang, therefore there's a beginning of time. The Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem supposedly claims that there's a beginning of time. So they have Bordet, Guth, and Vilenkin, and everybody come on and say, like, no, that is not what our theory says. You are lying to the public, basically. That is not what any of us have concluded. And then the last third, they deal with the no cause thing. And they say, well, actually, there's a lot of scenarios in physics today where there's a causality, where there's things that happen without a cause. It's especially likely before there are laws of physics, as we're talking about now, right? So we're talking about a state of being before there's a concretization of a universe governed by laws of physics. There won't be such a law of physics, right? So the fact that everything has a cause is no longer true. It's just like the only nothing comes from nothing. Like, that's a rule. So when you're starting with nothing, even that rule doesn't apply anymore, right? So there has to be a cause of that rule, or it just arises randomly, right? Or has this always been the case, or whatever, right? So that's the way of it. So they do the last third on causality and show that what Craig is saying about causality has no basis in science. It is contrary to what scientists are saying. And so having the actual scientists and mathematicians do this on all 3 points throughout one video, and then actually intersposing those with Craig, like videos, like clips of Craig, I thought was really definitive. Especially there's one moment in which gets to the point I was getting at just before, where they show when Craig makes these arguments to other experts, like on a video or something like that, he completely changes what he says.
Yes.
Right. So like when it comes to like the infinity argument, like you can't have an infinity. And they show this. They show him speaking to an audience saying actual infinity is logically contradictory. They basically show him saying that. And then they show him talking to an expert. Well, he'll admit, oh, well, yes, it's all experts agree that it's logically possible, but I think it's just metaphysically impossible. And, it's a meaningless statement, right? And so he tells the truth when he knows he'd get caught. But when he's talking to an audience who he knows is not going to know what he's talking about, is not going to challenge him, he'll just lie. And so he knows the truth. He knows what he's saying is false, but he says it anyway. And I find that there's only 2 kinds of people who use the Kalam argument anymore. And that's really gullible people, dupes who've been lied to and don't know they've been lied to, and they don't have the skills or aren't using the skills to fact check these things and know that these things are false. And then there are liars, the grifters. And I think William Lane Craig is in the grifter category. I think he's abusing logic and abusing the ignorance of the audience to basically snow them. Like, this is just a grift that he's running. And this video just conclusively shows that. And so I was so gratified when I saw that come out this year. I was glad that they did that.
Lawrence Krauss did accuse him of that at the very beginning of his series of debates. But then he kind of, in my conversation with him, he said, well, he wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. But after his conversation with Sean Carroll and everybody else, he doesn't seem to be moving away at all. Like every time he gets it wrong.
It didn't start with Carroll. It went back to Stenger, right? So he's dealing, so it goes back and back. And he's had articles cited at him. He's had quotes at him. He's had authorities cited at him over and over and over again for decades. And he doesn't change. So the fact that he doesn't learn, he doesn't respect the truth, to me just shows that this is a con that he's running. And it's just audiences who want to soak it up and aren't really thinking critically and saying, oh, wait a minute, is he snowing us? Like, is any of this even true? And of course, everybody who starts asking that ends up being an atheist eventually. But that's what happens here.
Yeah. Well, let's break it down a bit and let's probe infinity, because that area is a little bit sort of it's almost akin to magic.
Yeah, right. It's beyond most people because it's a very advanced level of mathematics, right? So you're not gonna. It's not going to come up in high school because it's not something that's going to come up in a profession. It's not the sort of thing that you're going to get into usually, and it's really difficult concepts. So I'm not surprised that people don't know about it, but there's lots of books and online articles and things that you can go to get up to speed, at least on the concepts. You don't have to master the math, but you should at least get the concepts down.
Yeah. So, well, we'll start with Aristotle and his concept of infinity, because there are two. He made a differentiation between two concepts of infinity. One is spread over spatial infinity, like the universe. If the universe is infinite, then infinity exists all at the same time, or the infinity that is happening over a ticking clock that has got an actual infinity and a potential part of that infinity that's yet to come to be realized. And he's conflating the two, because you'll notice that he will appeal to that is insane to suggest past infinity, but future infinity is all cool and dandy.
Yes. Well, and understanding this in context, Craig is an A theorist about time as versus a B theorist. This gets into the ontology of time and stuff. So he thinks that all time there's no perspective from which all time exists. So he can get away with that, right? He can say future infinity because it never gets there. So it's never really infinite. You know what I mean? So he can get away with that, saying that. But Aristotle was in favor of both spatial and past temporal infinity. So Aristotle did not say that actual infinities were impossible and potential infinities were the only things possible. That's what Craig says, but Craig is full of it. Every mathematician, every skilled mathematician will come on and tell you that Craig is full of it. That's simply not how it works in mathematics at all. So the question is, like, well, if everybody who's actual expert in this accepts that actual infinities are logically possible, then there can be a past infinity. Then the universe could always have existed and not have a beginning. What do? You're stuck, right? So what Craig will do is he'll introduce what are called paradoxes. His favorite one is Hilbert's Hotel. He'll describe Hilbert's Hotel and say, well, that's just absurd, and therefore actual infinities are impossible. And then what the Skydive Phil video does is have mathematicians come in and explain not only that is he describing Hilbert's Hotel and his conclusions incorrectly, but Hilbert's Hotel was old news. Like that all the experts since then have shown that Hilbert's Hotel does not prove what Hilbert thought it did. So it's basically an obsolete, long refuted thing. And I had this happen to me. I did a debate with a scholar who studies under William Lane Craig, and on my blog, and he pulled this out on me. And he cited a book for Hilbert's Hotel. He cited a book on Hilbert's Hotel when he used the Hilbert's Hotel thing. I said, well, did you even read that book? Because you do realize that book is a collection of articles by experts explaining why Hilbert is wrong, right? Like the whole book. So it's like he didn't know that the book he was citing is talking about this old essay by Hilbert, or this old essay by the inventor of this idea. But the book was about how that idea is obsolete now and is no longer accepted by experts, and why it doesn't lead to the conclusions of logical contradiction. So he didn't even read the book that he cited, but he'd cited it people. And I think in his case, he was largely one of the dupes. Like he just believed because someone told him that that's what this book says. He didn't know what the book actually said. He didn't check. And I think that is one of the problems we have to look for. Is like, don't let yourself be snowed. Like actually check these things.
So Hilbert's Hotel, for those who don't know, that's I think a mathematician by the name of David Hilbert developed the idea of, if you have a hotel with infinite number of rooms, all rooms are occupied, and you have a new guest wants to check in. You can actually do that by moving guest number 1 to room number 2 all the way to infinity, creating a space in room number 1, and then he accommodates that extra guest. But what he does at the very end, when he takes all the guests apart from 3 and says, well, but then that leaves only 3, but he doesn't understand that any subset of infinity is infinity. So those 3 will constitute infinity.
Well, yeah, it's not quite that so much, but it is true that that's the nature of infinity, right? Is the whole point is that you can have infinity of infinities, and well, if you had infinity of infinities, you've got another level of infinity. But you can have all kinds of infinities within an infinity, because that's the definition of infinity. And this is the trick that Craig relies on, is that he uses the rules of finite arithmetic to argue for a logical contradiction. This is what he'll present to a lay audience who doesn't know that they're being snowed by this. A mathematician will come back at him and say, well, actually, those premises, the axioms for finite mathematics, are invalid. Like, they're not true for transfinite quantities, for infinities. So you can't make that argument. It's using the wrong category of axioms. When you look at the axioms for transfinite numbers, for infinite quantities, all those rules go away. They no longer apply. So you actually could keep adding people to an infinite hotel, because that's what infinite means, right? So there's nothing logically contradictory about it. It only becomes contradictory if you are mistakenly imagining an infinite hotel as a finite hotel, and that's what Craig is trading on. Is this people are confusing finite, really large finite numbers with infinite numbers. These are categorically different quantities, and they have different properties because of that.
Yeah, and the play on the word full, because the word full is here's a trick, the definition of it.
Yes. Oh, that's a really good point out, that, because full is something that really only makes sense in finite arithmetic, right? It's playing on your intuitions for finite numbers, but these are transfinite numbers. So those rules don't apply anymore. The definition of full means something different in both contexts, because you're changing contexts.
Thank you for the super chat.
Yeah. So here's that Craig needs to pack it up. He does nothing to sway me from being an atheist. I wonder about him not recognizing all the Bible problems. Craig does try to avoid discussing Bible problems as much as possible. But when he does, boy, is it get weird. His latest book is on how Adam and Eve is true, and evolution, old Earth evolution, is also true. And he tries to reconcile them by creating some sort of scenario by which the soul got infused into primates like millions of years ago. I can't remember what he says, 150,000 or I don't remember what date he picks. But he picks it like a long, long time ago, way beyond young Earth creationists. So he pissed off all the young Earth creationists. But at least
he's consistent, Dr. Carrier. He always wants to have his cake and eat it too, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's what you see, like the kinds of things that he does when he tries to resolve biblical things. But generally, he tries to avoid them, or he'll be disingenuous. He'll, on one occasion, say, "Well, you don't have to believe everything in the Gospels is true," and then on another occasion, he'll swear that everything in the Gospels is true. And so it depends, and he'll just jump from one to the other based on what corner you've caught him in. And so this is another example of, I think he's running a grift.
So, Dr. Carey, you made a differentiation between two types of groups. There are, and I think that the vast majority of people have been preyed on because of their layman understanding of science, but then there are the deliberate ones. So here's a question about why do you think that the deliberate ones keep recycling the same argument? Do you think because those who have been preyed on, they're not interested in knowing the truth, or they have no capacity in understanding the complex ideas behind it?
Yeah, I think that's it. They keep using it because it works, right? It's like, I mean, the curse of my country, Donald Trump. Like, he would tell a lie and it would get solidly refuted with abundant evidence, but he wouldn't care. He would just keep repeating the lie over and over and over again. And people who are committed to his authority will just keep believing him. They'll ignore all the evidence. So if you have this con that keeps working, you're going to keep using it. So I think that's what's going on here. But also, it's important to note that, and this relates to a question that came up on the bottom of the screen earlier, I don't think William Lane Craig actually thinks that he's going to successfully convert atheists. I don't think that's his market.
No. It's keeping.
Right. His market are fellow Christians. He's disseminating control beliefs. And this is an important tactic. If you want to keep people in the flock, you have to
Yes.
keep telling them things that keep them there. And part of that is denigrating and trying to humiliate atheists. So like trying to defeat them smarmily in a debate is a way of making atheists look bad and say, oh, look, don't atheists look bad? You don't want to be an atheist, do you? Right? It's the same kind of tactic. So the attempt to try and rhetorically game atheists against atheists in debates.
So it's almost a marketing when the market is quite tough and you know you can't gain new business or customers, so you work on retention.
No, absolutely right. That is an excellent analogy, and I think that's exactly what he's doing. And he can count on Christians being pre-inoculated against critical thinking. That's the religion is kind of built around inoculating people against thinking for themselves, against questioning. And so when he comes out there and smarmily, arrogantly just declares these things, they feel the authority and the confidence to say, well, he can't be wrong. Look how confidently he's saying it. He would never lie, surely. Right. So that's how he keeps them in the loop. It's a control belief. It's a means to trap Christians in there. And I would say Muslim apologists who are pulling the same scam are doing the same thing. Like, they don't want Muslims to leave. They want trying to prevent apostates. They're not trying to gain converts. And that's usually when you see these grifters, this is their game. Their game is not converting atheists. Their game is retention, like you said.
Yeah. So mathematicians have accepted in the video, they've accepted their infinity does exist, and there is nothing contradictory about it, but you need not to commit the fallacy of composition by using parts of the system to imply how the system actually works. So it's an infinity, it's a system on its own. You gotta take it as its own way. But in the physical world, and there it goes, okay, well, infinity might be found in mathematics, but it's not found in the physical world. But you have also physicists saying, well, no, it is there, but the problem it is not observable, because obviously if it's
you can never confirm it, right? Because it would take infinite resources to count an infinite quantity, right? So there are actually indirect ways that you could do it. So a lot of Big Bang models assert that when you work out the model, after a certain time, the size of the universe becomes infinite. And it's very difficult to tell the difference between infinite and absurdly large, right? Because you could see the curvature. So if like the universe is one big giant sphere, a big enough sphere, everything looks flat. Right. And so that looks a lot like flat. Flat would be infinite, but just tiny, tiny, tiny curvature would be near that. So that's what makes observation difficult. You can show the universe is many, many, many times larger than we can observe. So we know that the actual universe has to be, I think the latest estimate was at least 70 times larger than the visible part of it. And the visible part of it is 30 light years across, right? Or 30 light years, 30 billion light years across. And the actual extent of the universe has to be at least 70 up to 200 times more in order to explain the curvature that we can see, because we can see, so we know it goes beyond the part we can see because the light doesn't travel long enough for us to see the rest of it. So we know it's much bigger. So the question is, could you argue from an observation that it is infinite, that the curvature is zero? And the answer to that is it's theoretically possible. We're not in a position now to actually literally do that. But it's theoretically possible to keep pushing the limit so that you can say that at the limit, it looks like the universe is infinitely large in space. But that's not necessary to do, right? So because his premise requires asserting that there was a beginning. It does not work if you say that there could have been a beginning. Then you say, well, then there could have been a first cause. So you can't get the conclusion with the possibility. You have to prove that it's the case. And that's what's the problem here, is that we actually have no evidence. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence suggesting otherwise, that the universe is not past eternal. And in fact, the evidence suggests that it is past eternal. Even the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkim theorem, the BGV theorem, which rests on certain assumptions, all it shows is that classical space-time in the current thread that we're in must terminate at a quantum moment. But that doesn't tell us anything about what's on the other side of that, right? So once you get into that quantum scale time, there could be a whole other bunch of classical time, right? That collapsed to a quantum time. And that could go on for infinitely amount of times. So the BGV theorem does not assert that there was a physical beginning. And this is one of the biggest lies that Craig says, because all of the experts he's even emailed them, and they've emailed him back and explained to him, you are wrong. You are not telling us, you're not saying the correct things. But Craig will twist what they're saying to try and keep insisting that they're saying exactly what they're not saying, the opposite of what they're saying.
Because
They're
beginning,
saying, no, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. The beginning was suggested by Guth and Vilankin wasn't the beginning of the universe, but the beginning of inflation. And they kept saying it's not the actual.
And it's the beginning of classical space-time of this universe. So there could have been endless universes before ours that they would have had to have collapsed to a quantum moment, or either entirely or in a particular location. So you could have, for instance, Smolin cosmology, which is the idea that every black hole generates a new universe. This is entirely possible. It's not been proven or anything. But if that's the case, you can have a quantum singularity inside the black hole that then moves in, creates a whole other classical space-time in an offshoot from the original universe. So the whole universe the previous universe doesn't have to collapse. It could just, a part of it could collapse to that quantum moment and then reignite a new inflation event that happens. It's a budding of another universe budding away from it. There are many other cosmological models that are mainstream, peer-reviewed cosmological models that do the similar or same thing. So all the BGV theorem shows is that classical space-time has to have a finite beginning, but that doesn't mean existence or time has a finite beginning. And this equivocation fallacy is what Craig trades on when he's lying to his audiences. And he trades on the difference between existence and universe too. Like universe means one single space, but there could be infinite universes, like multiverse going back in time. There could be simultaneous universes too, but there could be an infinite chain of them back in time. Saying that our universe had a beginning does not mean that time had a beginning, because time could keep going back through more and more universes that rise and collapse, and so on.
They even showed the model of the balance model where you have like an error image and it's linked to the singularity, and this is the border.
Correct.
Where all bits are off, and you have different type of physics for a while, and then it settles down again.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's all in the video, the Skydive Phil video. It's really good.
Fantastic.
Shown where they're making the point that you can have a classical space-time, it'll collapse to a quantum point, and now all bets are off. You just kind of reset. And then it can inflate into another classical space-time, but that'll be a separate universe. It's not the beginning of time. It's just the beginning of that little bubble of time, right? So and so that's the thing and they keep explaining this to him over and over again. They've been doing it for over 10 years. Craig just ignores them and keeps saying the same false things to audiences. So this is how I know this is a grift. Like he knows what he's saying is false.
They even said at the time of the collapse, even entropy itself resets.
Yeah, right. And there's a variety of ways that can happen too. Penrose's theory, for instance, which Craig will often cite Penrose, and Penrose will come back and no, that's I'm saying the opposite of that. Penrose has a similar idea where it's the opposite of a collapse. In Penrose's model, you have expansion until you have scale disruption, so that things expand so far that you've lost all sense of scale. Scale no longer means anything. And so that effectively de facto physically resets entropy. So you can have new things arise on a different scale and start over. And so now I don't necessarily know if this is true or false, but the point is, it is a peer-reviewed cosmological theory. It's in the science, it's in the journals. So you can't say it's impossible. When all scientists are saying, we're actually in favor of it. We actually think it's not more than possible. We think it's one of these things is probable, actually. And so you can't really get to it. That doesn't mean that there was a past eternality. It's possible there was a first point in time of all existence. We just can't prove that there was. There's no physical reason, nor mathematical or logical reason to assume that there was. So we can't get there from here. So basically, we can't get his premise. And so that's why that one premise, that alone is enough to destroy the argument, because you don't have that one premise, you don't get the conclusion. It's just all the worse that you can't get the other premise either, which is the last third of the video.
Indeed, and we reached sort of a point, and we'll take this question in a second. But even the physicists are sort of reaching an agreement now that the singularity, our ultimate, wasn't the ultimate beginning. It's an evidence.
Right. I don't think there are hardly any physicists, cosmologists certainly, who assume that anymore. There are some who propose it as a model, but I don't think in fact, I don't think there are any who would say that we know that to be the case, right? So they'll all say, well, there are actually past eternal models that are completely coherent and consistent with the evidence. And so even physicists like Hawking was a nutshell theorist. So he didn't think that there was a one moment of beginning of time, but he thought it was curved at the beginning, so it kind of ends in a circle. So there's no definite beginning of time, but there was kind of a finite amount of it. But even Hawking said well, this is just a theory of mine. There are other theories that have past eternal systems that are perfectly coherent, right? So he wasn't saying that it's impossible. He was just saying that, well, there's other ways to do it. Yeah, we know that. But Craig would take it and say like, oh, he said it's impossible. And say, that's not what he said. That absolutely not what he said.
And they fixed the problem finally by saying, well, you can count infinity providing that you have infinite time. So you can have infinite events and infinite time, and there is coherence. There's nothing contradictory about that.
Yeah, and that's the thing with infinity of time. It's not that there would be a moment when you were done, because there's an infinite amount of time.
Yes.
And this is actually, we've actually known this since Archimedes. We've certainly known it since Leibniz and Newton when they invented calculus, because calculus is based entirely on summing actual infinities. So what they did, Leibniz and Newton, they needed to solve the problem of there are an infinite number of changes of velocity in an acceleration over a second or an hour or whatever. So they tried, how do you sum an infinite number of changes? And so they came up with calculus. And so there's a way to do it that you can actually get an infinite sum, and it will be a finite number because of the way it works out. So, but they were using something that had been invented before by Archimedes. We actually know this from the Archimedes Codex, where he came up with also a geometric way to sum an actual infinity. And so we know how to do this. We've known how to do it for thousands of years, and we've definitely known how to do it for hundreds of years. So there's nothing weird about this at all. But it does it with you doing over a geometric space. So it's when you're counting an infinity, it's not that you're done at any particular time. It's that when you sum up all the time, you will have all the numbers in it, is basically, right? That's how it works, because we're dealing with transfinite quantities. So the rules work a little differently. It doesn't end at a particular time. It doesn't begin at a particular time, but the sum is still there and it stays the same. And so this is a thing that mathematicians well understand. But because Craig assumes his audience doesn't understand it, he's willing to pretend that it's not the case.
What do you think the difference here between the two groups of Christians, the young earth and old earth? What's the difference in the understanding between these two groups?
Yeah, it's like they say, are they so stupid they can't agree? Well, when you're talking about things that don't exist, of course you're going to have multiplications of disagreement, right? If you've already committed to believing things not based on evidence, then you're going to have endless disputes that you can never resolve, because you're not anchored in reality in any way, right? So that's why Christianity keeps severing and breaking up. Islam does too, a little more slowly.
Yeah.
It has the same fractioning.
It's a feature of religion, I think, or a bug of religion.
Right. And it may even be worse in Islam than it appears, because the way we define sect in Islam is the way we look at, like, well, what is an authority? What is a Sunni? What is a Shia, etc. Doesn't really take into account what's going on the ground, where actual individual Muslims, you might have 100 Muslims in a room and there's 100 different views of what Islam is among them, right? But it's not codified at the sectarian level. There's no authority saying that. So I think there's a lot more disagreement within Islam than is revealed in the sectarian literature. Whereas Christianity is very much based on, there's a church and there's a synod who runs the church and who decides what this church is going to say. And so you can visibly see the fracturing happen, because you can see the individual committees splitting off and starting their own churches and things. And so you can see the fractioning. And Christianity's got, what, 6,000? What is it? 6,000 sects? Something like, maybe more.
Crazy number.
Yeah.
And they continue to divert. Yeah, it's happening as we speak.
So yeah. But it's because they're all arguing about things that don't exist. So there's nothing to anchor what you're saying. You just have an authority who says something, and you either emotionally like it or you don't. And that's
Dr. Kareier, I maintain there are religions as many people, because every person will be sort of attracted. It's a subjective experience, and therefore it is a subjective state of mind. Therefore, I think if there are 5.5 billion religious people on Earth,
it'd be 5 billion religions
and gods.
You're not far wrong. And this has been noted by scholars recently when they're talking about heresy. And a good example you can really detect is Trinity. So in Christian view of the Trinity. So there are official views of the Trinity, and there's a finite number of these, like, ways you can interpret the Trinity or reject the Trinity, like the Jehovah's Witnesses do. There are different ways you can do it. But when you start talking to lay people, and it's funny that they have all these heresies that are anti-Christian heresies, they would claim, like anti-Trinitarian heresies, and they have lists and names of them and descriptions of them, like a whole zoology of it. But when you go to their own constituents, like the Baptists, you go talk to actual individual Baptists and ask them to explain the Trinity, you find all the heresies. So like all the actual rank and file people are like, their view of the Trinity is some heresy or other. But their own church, their own sect, who declare them a heretic for saying that, they just kind of like, well, okay, whatever, you're just misinformed, because they don't want to lose them, right? So they just kind of avoid the issue as much as possible, because it's a third rail. But like you said, like I think in reality, people have their own idea of what God is and what theology. They've their own answers for theology, which is another sect unto itself, different from the one that they profess. They might say they're a Baptist, but really their full set of beliefs won't align exactly with every Baptist among them. So that is true. I think that's the case.
So I think we're done with infinity, and let's go to the one subject that has been still in debate and nobody agrees on it: causation and causality. From all the way from Plato, Aristotle to Hume and Russell. And quantum mechanics will raise the eyebrow if you still think causality is a thing.
Right.
What do you think? The play on words here. The universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause.
Right. But we know, so the idea is like, so in that case, so this is different from past eternality, right? So the way they get around it with God is, well, he always existed, but there's a problem there, because they're saying that time cannot be past eternal, which means that there was a time when there was no God, right? Or there was always a God. Now, if there was always a God, like say time begins at time t1 and God is there, just poof, God's there, and then time starts ticking. There couldn't have been a God before that, because you can't exist before time. But if that's the case, why does it have to be a God? Like, why can't it just be, a quantum singularity? Like what necessitates it being this bizarre immaterial entity that exists there for no reason, when it could just be a simple, physically definable, actually currently, in many respects observable quantum singularity, and that just. But
if you recall, Dr. Carrier, this is where William Lane Craig makes this crazy leap after this scientific speech, and he goes to the personal experience of Jesus and the resurrection in a strange jump.
Yeah. Right. And there goes the circular argument, right? It's like the experience of Jesus proves Jesus, but then we can prove that that's plausible with the Kalam, but we can prove the Kalam is plausible by the experience of Jesus. Yes, and you get round and round it goes. No, that's true. He does that. He has attempted on occasion to argue the mechanical versus the immaterial cause thing. That somehow at the beginning of time, you can't have a mechanical cause before there is mechanical causes. So therefore, you must have an immaterial cause. But that runs into the same problem. Like, how can you have an immaterial cause before there are causes? Like that's a contradiction as well. So if you're saying that there's just a cause that exists for no reason that started everything, well, now you're admitting that cause could be anything, right? And so like, if we're going to pick at random, you're not going to get a God, right? You're going to get something else as the random cause. And so really, if there could be a God that started it all, and the God has no cause and no reason for being, then it needn't be a God. If you're admitting that it could be anything that exists for no reason and is the first cause. And so even admitting that there's a first cause doesn't get you to God. So that is one significant problem. And that's one that they don't go into in this Skydive Phil video. They focus only on the science and the math. But I think even the theology fails here for that same reason. But what they do in the last third of their video is they bring scientists on to explain that we actually don't know that everything has a cause. Like that assumption is actually not well established. And in fact, the evidence we have for it doesn't lead to that conclusion. It leads to a different conclusion, which is that everything within the universe has a cause. You can't actually leap from that to before causes, there has to be a cause, because that's self-contradictory, right? So it's entirely possible that if you get down to the quantum level and before any structure arises that necessitates causation, that anything could happen, right? Literally anything. And so there's no constraint anymore. And so within the current physics, the physicists will tell you, like, we know that there are conditions that we can imagine, that we can construct in our models, where causation is no longer a fundamental. And there's nothing incoherent about that. It's not logically necessary for there to be a cause of a thing. Causes are only things that we observe, but they're only things that we observe in a certain structure, once we're in the structure. And so you're really only talking about that structure. When you're talking about something before that structure, well, those observations no longer apply. And so you can't jump from one category to the other, which is what Craig does. He tries to say, like, from within this structure, we see everything has a cause, and even that's challengeable. Therefore, before the structure there was, and the physicists will say, like, that's a model violation. Like, that doesn't hold at all. And then, of course, you get to, like you were hinting at, quantum mechanics. It's entirely possible that even now we're observing acausal physics in quantum phenomena. So, like, the randomness of atomic decay does not appear to have a cause. It just spontaneously randomly happens. Now, it's constrained by certain laws that limit when and how it happens or how frequently. But there's when exactly the atom splits, or when exactly a neutron flies off of it, or whatever.
Oh, the half-life situation, yeah.
Right, we cannot define it. We can't come up with any actual cause of that. It just seems to just randomly happen. And there are many physicists who say, well, then maybe that is actually just what's happening, that there is no cause. There are also physicists who say, well, maybe there is a cause. But the thing is both physicists will admit that there might not be. Like, they'll both say, like, well, whether what I think is irrelevant, what is possible, it is possible that there is a causality at a certain scale. And the thing is like, and so Craig will say, well, you don't see a rabbit just pop out of nowhere. And a physicist will say, well, hold on. Imagine, let's look at what you're asking. You're asking for a whole rabbit. So we're talking trillions of atoms, and not just any atoms, specific atoms, arranged in a specific, weird, particular way. And so you can go into the statistics of what it would take to randomly get a rabbit, even if randomness completely defined everything, right? Let's just say, let's assume there is no causality. Everything is just random. To randomly get a rabbit, you're not going to see that but once every umpteen bazillion trillion years, because the conjunction of random events is so huge that the probability of that arising by random chance, you're never going to see it. It's just rarely going to happen. But that would then explain why we don't see it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This is the thing where you can build all of classical physics on top of a foundation of pure randomness, because what we see emerge as physics are all the highly probable random outcomes.
Yes.
And all the highly improbable random outcomes we're not going to see hardly ever, because they are so rare. So you could build all of classical physics on complete randomness. It is possible to do this. And quantum mechanicists will tell you this. Like, this is not news.
Yeah. So with virtual particles, we know that things pop up in and out of existence, but they are at a basic level. Obviously, with a tiger, I think they use a tiger in a lounge, in their living room. That is a very complex emergent property, and it will take evolution for it to emerge in other set of laws.
Yeah, virtual particles appear and disappear randomly, so it takes a lot of effort to get them to stick around. And in fact, that's a lot of the cosmologies, the inflationary cosmologies, are about how much energy does it take for a random fluctuation to stick around. And then, of course, what happens when that happens? You get inflation, etc. So a lot of cosmology is based on this random chance leads to this runaway outcome, which we call a universe. But look how much time it took to build that, right? Like, and how much energy it took in the beginning. Like, it had to be a huge amount of random stuff. And so that's why you don't see. And this is the other thing is, you can look on Wikipedia. There's a calculable probability that my finger will become a Big Bang and start a whole new universe, like right now. Now that probability, this is in quantum mechanics, according to quantum mechanics. There is a calculable probability of that, but the probability is so absurdly small that we wouldn't see it we don't even have a word for the number of years that it would take for that to happen. It's so extremely rare. But that means you can have an endless succession of Big Bangs, right? And you just don't see it because they're gazillions and gazillions of years apart because of random chance. It requires too much improbability for it to happen all at once.
And the trick, Dr. Carrier, is, and this is where the sleight of hands and the suggestive words, once you add the word cause, your mind straight away as a layman goes into intention and deliberate action. Somebody's out there planning something, but we know that a damaged car, and you asked, why was the car damaged? A tree fell on the car. Why did the tree fall on the car? Because there was a storm. And all of these causations don't require any intelligent agency behind them. So you can still have causation, absence of intelligence and deliberate design.
Yeah, and in fact, it's more likely, right? In the absence of us, let's look at the whole history of the Earth. The Earth's been around 4 billion years, right? most of the causes on the Earth are obviously not caused by intelligent agents, because we've only been around like a tiny fraction of the history of the planet. And then you get to the history of the solar system and the history of the universe and all of this. So most causes are not intentional agents. But yeah, people have that assumption that cause implies some sort of intention. I think Craig is more subtle in his exploitation of that confusion. I think he will dance around that.
Yes.
But you're right. I think sometimes I think he is banking on that people making that assumption.
Yeah, I think you're right. He tailors the conversation depending on the audience.
Yeah,
so if the audience is a bit savvy, I think he would refrain from embarrassing himself.
Yeah, for sure. Or he would refuse to debate. This is the other thing. It's like when he knows someone knows his game, he will not debate them. So that's why he won't debate John Loftus, Jeffrey Lauder. He probably wouldn't debate me on this argument again. He debated the resurrection with me one time, but he won't do it again. That's the other thing. So he's not going to debate me again on that.
I've got to look that up.
So he'll say like, well, I've already debated him once. I don't need to debate him again. So, right. So he'll avoid debates with people when he knows they know his game. And so that's part of his game, right? It's how he does that. But back to the point we were making before about causation and randomness. If you have like quantum mechanical events, right, or super small scale, super simple, and you can have a simple event lead to a runaway inflation, like we see that most cosmological theories adopt today for the universe. That requires a very simple starting point, like simple in terms of its structure. It is structurally simple. Whereas a super intelligent, super powerful God has extraordinarily complex structure. So you have to explain, where does that come from? Why is there this incredibly complex, remarkable structure there? That doesn't make any sense. When the cosmologist comes along and says, well, I can explain everything with just a really simple structure, a really simple starting point, way simpler than your super intelligent supermind. And so this is the thing that scientists look at. That's why scientists never take the God explanation seriously, is the theory is just too absurdly complex and poorly defined. Like it doesn't make any predictions, right? So it's kind of tailored to avoid making predictions so that you can never falsify it. Whereas the cosmological theories that we adopt actually do make predictions and are falsifiable, or would be falsifiable if we could disconfirm inflation, for example. We would rule out a ton of currently popular cosmological theories. But they all start with these super simple beginnings, like super simple relative to the ultra complexity, the supreme complexity of a God. Gods are way too complex an explanation to be the first explanation of something. And this is the thing, it's a basic understanding of science that I think Craig tries to avoid. He's not going to educate his audience on this. He wants to avoid this.
Yeah. I mean, when he talks about his God, all the bets are off. The rules of logic, everything collapses at that point, and there's almost a new set of rules. But what we're saying, it's exactly that, but for the universe. So, in a balanced situation, that's exactly what happens. And you don't need to add anything. This is an Occam razor. It's its best. You're not adding any extra steps. Actually, Will misunderstood Occam's razor by we go for the simplest explanation, which is, I think, it's a horrible distortion of the Occam razor.
Yes, right. I agree.
I think we should say, whatever takes you to the conclusion with the least amount of steps.
That's the way to put it.
Extra steps to
correct.
He's adding God, which in its own right needs a way bigger explanation.
Yeah. You're trying to explain one thing by an even more inexplicable thing, right? So you're going backwards as far as explanatory economy goes. That's why it's the worst theory that there is.
There's a new, and I think it's sort of branched out of this particular argument, and it's the argument from contingency or necessary being.
Yeah.
Do you find it's exactly this argument, but using a slightly different angle? So instead of using causation or causality, here you're using again a flaw in the common sense, or something that we observe as a common sense, that things are emergent, most of them, but if you go back, there must have been one that has to be necessary and not caused again. So it's, again, I think it's the same argument, but playing with different set of words.
Yeah, and they'll use the same ancillary arguments too. So like you could say, well, sure, but it's an past infinite string of contingencies. Well, there you go. And so that's when they'll get into, well, you can't have an actual infinity, Hilbert's Hotel, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll go to the same place, right? Ultimately, it is just a disguised version of the same argument in a way. But then you can have, well, okay, so you have a past infinite series of contingent events. Then you could ask, why does that past series of contingent events exist rather than some other? And you could still, that's a valid question to ask, but then there are a lot of answers. Well, it's random, or that series is logically necessary, and that doesn't get you to God either, right? So like, there's a lot of different answers you could give. None of them lead to God. You always have to have some sort of gap where you're jumping across a chasm where you hand wave and somehow God pops out as the answer. But none of these arguments actually, they at least are intriguing arguments towards something like the ground of all reality. Like you could talk about some sort of what I call an ontological what's it, like some sort of thing. You could build a lot of different arguments that get you to say, well, there must be some sort of grounding to all of this of some kind, even if it's randomness. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but that doesn't get you to God, right? Like, and that's what physicists are doing, is they're trying to figure out what is the actual thing. And in a sense, superstring theory is an attempt to get at this, for instance, because it doesn't have to be a God. And in fact, God is a terrible version of this. He's the worst explanation because he's too complicated and too unprecedented. Like it's a concept, a model for which we have no precedent to base it on. Like you look at Krauss's universe from nothing, where he's starting with a quantum initial starting point. Everything that's present in his initial starting point is stuff that we have observed. So we know it exists. So it doesn't make any sense. Like, and if he can accomplish the result with that, why do we need to posit these completely unobserved realities, these supernatural powers and things that we have no observational evidence for? Well, why go there? There's no reason to go there, which is why no one gets to God this way. This is only, like we were talking about before, control belief. This is just a way to keep people believing in God once they've emotionally invested in it. No one starts from an atheist and becomes a God because of these silly arguments.
The existence of gods caused so many problems. Morality is out of the window when you add the divine command theory, because it makes the whole thing arbitrary and quite turbulent. The other one would be God having to use a certain recipe in the fine tuning, otherwise the cake wouldn't be cooked properly.
Like what's constraining God in that way? Like that
exactly.
That suggests that there's another God who's forcing this God that he has to make the universe that one way. That doesn't make any sense either, right? Yeah. So this is a point I made long ago in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God, which is that all these theories of God actually imply that there's some other God, even more greater than him, that's constraining him. Because otherwise, why are his hands tied? Every Christian apologetic is like, well, God's hands tied, he can't. It's like, well, why doesn't he stop bullets? Well, he can't for some reason. And it's like, well, hold on. So you're saying there's some power greater than God that's actually preventing God from being a good person. So you have to keep inventing these epicycles after epicycles after epicycles. So this is why the explanation becomes inflationarily complex, right? And so whereas you could just do away with this massively complex, unnecessary explanation by just going straight to the physics, like Krauss and others do.
I think this was cleverly put by Dark Matter, the cartoon thing about God, and the angel shot the God at the very end, and then God dies and realizes he actually was another God who created him, and kept going up in the seven skies to find another God, and finally they ended up with man, who created all the gods.
Right? Yeah.
It was a fantastic ending.
That is the ultimate parable, I think, is accurate.
Oh, yeah. Here's another question.
Yeah, if I was trying to steelman the KCA, the question asks, what do I feel would be the strongest argument in its favor? Is there one? Strongest? See, this is I was interested by a terrible argument that is somehow stronger than another terrible argument. This is always a difficult one. And then it depends on what your metric is, right? So if I were to pick by the argument that I think would land the best, because I expect the audience to be least informed about it, I would say the argument from infinity, the argument from non-infinity, I guess I would put it, is the strongest only because the concepts that refute it are at a higher level than the audience is going to be. So it's going to be the most successful as a grift, right? So, but that doesn't really mean strength. That's not argument strength the way philosophers mean it. So like strength is in it actually increases the probability of the proposition. There isn't one. There is no proposition that increases the probability of any of the premises in the Kalam. And since the Kalam conclusion is a product of the premises, you just can't get up the probability. There is no strong argument for it.
Yeah, in my opinion, I agree with you, because it's a false premise to start with, but the strength of it, it's elaborate scheme. It plays on physics, and it plays on issues
That's
that
a
looks
good
like
point.
science from the outside and philosophy, but so to the audience, they're wowed, bamboozled by all these terms
Yeah.
and infinities. So that's why it's strong from the outside.
Right.
Fake.
That captures it. I think that really captures what I meant. Truly.
So 25 years, I think William Lane Craig has been touring the world, parading the same argument. He's refined it over the years a little bit here and there, maybe tailoring it to the audience.
Oh yeah.
In your opinion, when he debated multiple people, who is the one debater that sort of kind of cast the terror in William Lane Craig's heart in terms of debunking him?
Well, on this subject, Carroll, obviously, the Sean Carroll debate was a disaster.
No.
And that was because Carroll did what other scientists advised that he do in this debate. He says, you know what, he's going to keep misciting Guth and everybody. Get Guth to put something so you can bring up a slide, because you know he's going to say it, because Craig always does the same thing over and over, so you know it's coming. Get Guth to hold up a sign and have a picture and bring up the slide, and that's what he freaking did. And I was like, that is the kind of thing I would do. I was like, that was masterpiece. No, Carroll really did him in. The Krauss debate was actually pretty good too on this subject. I think Krauss got frustrated because Craig kept doing the Donald Trump thing, because Craig kept just denying everything that Krauss would say. Like, and then Krauss would get flabbergasted. Like, look, I've said no multiple times, and you keep trying to like assert that I said something I didn't say, and it was just a constant gainsaying. And so that which is a debate failure. That's the failure mode of a debater. And so I suspect Craig wouldn't admit it, but I think he really was on the ropes there, because he didn't have anything left. So all he could do is keep doing a Donald Trump on him and just continuing to gainsay what he said. And you see that a lot in the Krauss debate, and that's why that debate is really frustrating. The Carroll debate is actually more informative, because Carroll got to explain a lot of cool shit, and there was less that Craig could do. Or Craig was doing less gainsaying because of the structure of the debate didn't allow him to do that as much as he wanted to do.
Yeah, I agree. Sean Carroll's would have been my favorite. I think Krauss I love Krauss, but I think he got a bit animated and a bit too engaged.
Which I understand, because that happens to me. Like when that happens to me, that happens to me, right? So like, because Craig was just denying over and over again things that Krauss would say, and I was like, what do you do? Like after the third time of that in a sequence, what do you do? As a debater, I'm at a loss. Like, I'm thinking, like, why is this still happening? I don't understand. Where do I go? I've repeated myself 3 times, and they keep denying what I said. I don't know what I don't.
Flies over the head.
Right? Yeah, so you get frustrated. I totally understand that. Another debate that's not on this subject is the Kagan debate on the moral argument. So Craig and Kagan. Kagan annihilated Craig on this argument.
What was the topic? I need to look that up. What was
the moral argument for God?
The moral argument.
Yeah. It's that morality exists, therefore God exists.
So Kagan is another philosopher?
Yes. In fact, he's a specialist in metaethics and moral
fantastic.
Theory. Craig was just deer in headlights in this. He just couldn't do anything. It was a disaster. And I think that's because he just was inadequately prepared. He was expecting a lightweight. He wasn't expecting an actual professional philosopher who's a master of the subject. And it's not enough to be a master of the subject, because you can still suck at debates and be a master of subject. But Kagan kept his cool and organized his thoughts and communicated really well. And so those things come together. It comes across very clearly, and that's how you defeat Craig, is by maintaining that. And Kagan did a really good job.
So, I mean, we're heading towards the last part of the conversation here, and want to put all the strings back together. There's obviously two types of apologetic schools. One that would use the actual theology itself to prove God, to talk about the miracles of Jesus, and that's what most people are vested in a church, the emotional part, the group, the feeling, the relation. But then there's a new trend of, okay, well, science must be in vogue right now. Everybody wants to have a piece of science.
Yeah.
Therefore, the apologetics for God need to evolve as well, and need to include some clever scientific bits, hopefully in areas that we yet to discover or we don't know. So exploiting again areas we're not quite sure about just yet. What do you think of that approach?
No, absolutely. And also exploiting things that the audience, as you can expect, doesn't really know very well. Even things that we've answered pretty well, but they don't know really well. Evolution is a classic example of this, although I think that well has been pumped dry. I think that's why people like Craig don't go there anymore, because that is a losing argument. It only makes you look more and more stupid over time. So that's why Ken Ham is kind of a joke. And but that used to be the hot thing, right? So the 80s and 90s, like attacking evolution was the way, and then trying to say that science proves creationism was all of the thing that was happening. And so you still see the burning embers of the dying star of this movement in like Answers in Genesis Online and stuff like that. But it's becoming inefficacious because it's so easy to refute this stuff, and it's so thoroughly debunked now.
If you want to hear someone who loses really his shit in a debate, it would be Aaron Ra versus Ken Ham.
Completely lost. I'm not surprised. Ken Ham's a lunatic. Yeah. I don't know what I would do in a debate against Ken Ham. So it would just be impossible. I would just be laughing all the time.
He still talks about rocks turning into like monkeys. Like it's just
yeah. Oh, see, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's like, no, we've explained this to you multiple times. Why are we going back to this? Oh, Jesus. Yeah. At least, some of the better apologists try to keep up their game, like try to get ahead of it. But they do, like you say, like they try to make science say the things that they want, because science has prestige. So.
Thank you so much, Dalai Lama, for the very generous super chat. And it looks like he's an avid follower.
Yeah, he must have been on the Myth Vision AMA earlier.
Almost, yeah. And thank you, Trusted Living, for becoming a new member. And at the end, Dr. Carrier, I want to maybe pose a couple of questions, and maybe we can wrap it up at that point.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
So with that evolution of using scientific gaps, the God of the gaps again, obviously it's all over again, but that gap is closing. It's really, it's narrowing. I think it's maybe the beginning of the universe, abiogenesis, what happens after death. David Chalmers called it the hard problem of consciousness, but we've agreed it's not that hard.
Yeah. I mean, there are hardnesses to it, but it is overblown, the problem. Certainly from an apologetical perspective, you can't get to God there. And you certainly can't get to afterlife, dualist afterlife beliefs. Really, the only afterlife it's plausible based on evidence we have would be the standard transhumanist narrative of preserve and replicate your brain in new, hardier tech. That's really it. That if you're going to live forever or anywhere near forever, that's your only path. Otherwise, dead is dead. There's just no evidence to rescue it, no matter how much you might want to have faith and desire it to be otherwise.
Yeah. Some on your personal convictions. I mean, you've obviously been an atheist for some time now. Has anything changed over the last 10 years in your views?
In my views? Yeah. I can't be precise as to whether 10 years, but certainly within the 10 to 15, I've become, my political views have altered a little bit. So that means at the final productive end, the policy end, the fundamentals of what governments are for and things like that hasn't changed. But because I'm an empiricist, so I'm a political empiricist, my policy positions are always about what works. What does evidence show works, rather than ideology, rather than trying to make something conform to an ideology? What actually accomplishes the goal you have, and therefore you have to decide what goals are worthy. And so I've changed. So, for instance, I'm a big proponent of universal basic income now, because of the way we structured our economy, the way wealth has been distributed. We actually could do universal basic income. And it would actually be a more equitable, and not only that, it would actually be better for the economy, better for national security, and better for society in every respect. Mm-hmm. And all the objections that people offer to that would be the things holding me back in the past, right? But now there's a lot of evidence in. There's been a lot of empirical testing. There's been a lot of evidence gathered about what happens when you do things like UBI, and all of the objections are refuted empirically.
But the problem is, how do you get around implementing that, knowing the greed
Right.
of man? You know?
Everybody, the rich control the legislature, so you're never going to get UBI. Is the basic idea. But in terms of philosophical position, it would even be in their interest to do it. This is the other thing, is that the ultra wealthy are really phenomenally stupid in terms of like their own health and welfare and their well-being. They would be better off endorsing this, and because even if you're a total Machiavellian, if you're Bezos and you're multi-billionaire, UBI gives you customers, idiot. If you want to sell stuff, UBI is the way forward, right? And it actually helps winnow out winners from losers in your capitalist game, because it's the big winners are the ones who are going to exploit all the cash that's now in the market because of UBI, and will be able to afford to fund it. Whereas the one against it will be practicality. I mean, if socialism failed at a country level, why would it work on a universal level? Right, but this isn't socialism, right? So let's just say form of socialism, but it isn't communism, for example. Communism is where everybody owns everything, which is very different. I believe in hybrid economies. You need socialism and capitalism working in conjunction to check each other's successes, which we know works. We've seen it. There's tons of economic evidence on this now. But anyway, so I've moved more towards these kinds of radical positions, and like UBI, for instance. So those are some of the things that have changed. I'm also a Bayesian now, right? So I wasn't in 2005. That was right before I discovered I was an anti-Bayesian then. And so when I discovered Bayesian epistemology and I had that moment, the eureka moment, where I was like, oh my God, all my objections are wrong. This is brilliant. This is why haven't I always been a Bayesian? And then I've started re-looking at everything through the lens of Bayesian probability theory. And I was able to reconstruct my epistemology. So my epistemology is now Bayesian. It still adapts a lot of the things I was doing more roughly before, but it makes it more rigorous and more accurate to things. And I'm able to notice things I didn't notice before. So my counter apologetics now, I've realized, is it's all about the evidence they're leaving out. So you pick any argument for God. It's all based on leaving evidence out. And when you put that evidence back in, it flips the argument to the opposite conclusion. It actually becomes evidence against God. And you can pick any argument for God, and this happens. And I show this in my Bayesian counter-apologetics article on my blog. So you can go to richardcarrier.info and look for Bayesian counter-apologetics, and you'll find I give 10 of the top arguments for God and show how they all flip the other way once you put evidence in that they're leaving out. And you can do that with Bayesian logic. You can also show why all the excuses to explain away evidence actually reduce rather than increase the probability of the theory you're defending. So, Dr. Richard, you can do a lot of this stuff with Bayesian. In Bayesian analytics, you leave no data out. Everything enters the right. Otherwise, you're using it. Otherwise, it's a toy model. You're not talking about reality anymore. If you're leaving stuff out, you can leave stuff out as an exercise to see what would be the case. But you're not talking about what is the case. If you want to talk about what is the case, all the evidence goes in, all of it. Like literally, like in your background knowledge has to be everything else. Like what color rabbits are is relevant, right? It goes in there, right? Like everything goes in there. If you're ignoring anything, you're leaving stuff out, you're gaming the system, and you're no longer talking about reality. You're talking about whatever fiction you want to promote. Big shout out to my friend Derek Lambert from Midvision. Guys, check his channel out. He's saying hello. Finally, on morality, are you consequentialist then by sort of the? Yeah, not only am I a consequentialist, I did my article, Is Philosophy Stupid? You can Google me, Richard Carrier, Is Philosophy Stupid? And find I gave a speech on it, but I have my notes I put online. I point out like what are the areas of progress that philosophy has made, and people say philosophy doesn't make progress. And so actually it does, because there are these actually governing assumptions now that we take for granted that are actually advances philosophically. And one is consequentialism is the only game in town now. They're really, apart from some Christian apologetics, in mainstream philosophy and peer-reviewed academic department philosophy, all theories are consequentialist in one form or another. Even deontological ethics is fundamentally consequentialist in the way they argue how you pick your deontology. So consequentialism has won. Basically, is the argument. The interesting question then is what form of consequentialism, and that I haven't changed. I've gotten better and more sophisticated in my ability to articulate and defend it. I've gotten my stuff peer reviewed since 2005. In 2005, I advanced my theory, my goal theory of ethics in Sense and Goodness Without God. But as of 2011, 2012, something like that, in the book, the anthology, the Loftus anthology, The End of Christianity, I produced a peer-reviewed chapter defending it. So it has now become an official entry in the field of philosophy.
See, I'm very, very similar to you, because it's almost like that worldview follows. It flows nicely. Your epistemology is statistical and empiricist in nature. Your morality is based on the final outcome, and based on morality is never going to be black and white. There are 50 shades of gray, and you've got to always choose. Sometimes choosing between two good outcome or two bad outcomes. You know, it's very interesting, but it's a worldview that is coherent. It's consistent, I think.
Which I've striven for, right? Ever since I realized Taoism was false back in 1991, I think it was, I've been striving to say, well, what is true? And the goal has been to build a worldview that's not only coherent with itself, but then is also coherent with all the evidence that I gather in the world, from personal experience, from scholarship, from science, and everything. It all has to tie together and work together. And so I've been working on that, and it took me, what was it, from 91 to 05, that was 15 years, almost 14 years, until I got Sense and Goodness Without God. And now it's been 15, 17 years since then, and I've refined it even more since. And like I said, I've adopted Bayesian epistemology and now incorporated that, and found that actually integrates really well. And by continuing to apply my empiricist politics, I've evolved my policy positions based on evidence, which is what I should do. What everybody should do, really. So that's to me, that's gratifying that I've been able to get there, because I've been striving for it, to see where you land when you try to make something coherent with itself and with all the evidence that actually exists.
And finally, Dr. Karyir, do you want to tell the followers about any projects you're working on, any new books, anything you're going to be introducing in the next few months?
Nothing big. I'm going to be presenting at the Brea, California. There's the Society of Biblical Literature Regional Conference. I'm giving the opening talk on, it's a 15-minute presentation, nothing fancy, on the state of historicity of Jesus in the field today, based on the peer-reviewed literature. I'll be doing that at the end of this month. So people are interested in that can go check that out. If you're interested in meeting me around in that area at that time, you should message me. And so the way to do that is go to my blog. I have an announcement about my Brea, California appearance. Go read that blog, and it explains what to do to see if we can come together with some sort of meetup. I don't think it's possible. I won't be able to pull it off because there's all these COVID restrictions and things, so I might not be able to do it. I had been hoping that I would be able to by now, but we're not quite out of it yet. So I don't know if I'll be able to pull something together, but I need to know who's interested and who's in the area. And so if you get in touch with me that way, I can coordinate. And if anything will come to fruition, that'll happen. But you can also see me if you pay for the registration to go to the conference. You can see me give the talk at the very least. I can't say that it's going to be that exciting in particular. Other than that, no, my main thing now is the blog. So I'm really avidly interested in acquiring more Patreon patrons, because that's really, you're really helping me create good, solid articles for everyone to read. So there's no paywall on my website for that reason. My patrons are the ones who make that available to the world, essentially. So the world can read my work that way, both in philosophy and in ancient history. And then my classes. So every month now I'm doing any one of my 10 classes that you want. So you can go to my website, take classes, and see. They're quick 1-month courses with assigned readings and assigned challenge questions. But really also it's 1 month where you've got my attention. Every day you can ask all the questions you want about the subject and get useful answers from me. So that's one way to benefit and engage with me if you want to. So take one of my classes. That, and then just my books, buy my books. There's also the Crestus app. I make a royalty off of that. More updates are coming up for that, but all of that stuff you can find on my website. So at richardkaryir.info. You can also find my Facebook feed there, my Twitter feed. My Twitter feed is just announcements, blog articles, appearances, like this even. But my blog will sometimes, or my Facebook page will sometimes throw up personal thoughts that, maybe controversial personal thoughts that come along that are not fully thought out blog articles. So if you're interested in that kind of side of me, that'd be following me on Facebook would be the way to go there.
The last super chat of the day, and it's not a question, it's more of a sort of a request, that political empiricism is kind of interesting, and people are asking, maybe you can write an article and see.
That's a good question. I'll keep that in mind. I haven't settled on a way to do that yet. Obviously I do it already, like in my book, how I describe doing it. And if you go in my blog and there's the category drop-down menu and do politics and just read the entries there, you'll see it exemplified, like how my empiricist politics works. So what I haven't gotten to now is so those are all examples, and figure out what general principles can I pull out of those examples to create a methodology or something. I know what the methodology is in my head, but trying to do a blog on it, I'm not there yet as to how to best articulate it. But you can see it yourself, and get it, start to model it yourself, to copy what I'm doing by looking at how I've done it in political issue after political issue on my blog.
Dr. Carrier, it was fantastic to have you as ever. I hope that we've put this argument to bed, but I don't think so. I think we see a lot of it still.
It isn't us that put it to bed. It's the actual experts that put it to bed. So we're just the messenger, right? But I think it's absolutely true. I think this is really embarrassing for Christian apologists to continue using this argument. I really believe that, because these are so decisively, provably false premises. You can't argue this anymore. You really just can't. It's like young Earth creationism. It's that ridiculous now. So they really need to give it up. The vote is in on this. It's just not an argument that's going to work, and it will only work in terms of persuasion on people who aren't going to critically fact check it. Everybody else is going to be immune to it and laugh.
They're banking one thing, Dr. Carrier. They're banking on the fact that we haven't evolved to find truth or to find epistemology, but just to survive.
Yeah, you're right.
and that's a very pleasing.
Right.
Yeah. if it works, it works. So
yeah. That's their attitude. They would never admit that, but that is in practice what they're doing. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you folks enjoyed the conversation today, and hopefully we'll have Dr. Carrier next few weeks chatting about a different topic. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. Good night, y'all.